to week 11 of GID216, Motion Graphics for Interactive Media. All right, let's take a look at the week 11 module. We'll take a look down here, see what's going on. Okay, so our main topic of interest this week is the role of color, and we are calling it an imperfect tool. We'll talk about why in a minute. So this is one of our basic tenets of visual literacy that we are covering this semester, along with our explorations into motion graphics. So we're going to talk about the unreliability of color theory and yet why we need it. We're going to look at some color models, the psychology of color, and we're going to get into all that in a little bit. Prior to that, or maybe shortly after that, you're going to want to consume these two videos. This one here is Your Red the Same as My Red, which talks about sort of the biological differences from human to human and how we all perceive color differently based on the way your eyeballs are structured. And then this here is a little more prescriptive. This is Getting Started with Color Theory, which goes over sort of the basics of color theory for beginners. Now, you've probably already learned some color theory in your other classes, so you're probably familiar, but just in case, it never hurts to have a little more of a refresher. Okay, so those are the two consumables this week, those two videos. In a second, we're going to get into sort of a detailed explanation and discussion about color models, the psychology of color, applicable color, etc., etc. Before we do that, just a reminder that you have a media analysis due this week. This is media analysis number 3. The topic this time around is movies. So this one's going to function a little bit differently because movies are a little more sort of difficult to get our hands on. So if we look at the media analyses and go down to media analysis movie right here, you can see that just like the previous media analysis, you can work with a classmate, you can work individually. Your goal is to consume the piece of media, watch it once for entertainment, once for analysis, take some notes, and your goal is going to be to respond to these specific questions which are geared towards the movie itself. There are a couple questions about sort of your first impressions, your first response to the movie. 3 questions on the structure of the movie. A whole bunch of questions about the characters that appear in the movie. A little bit about the aesthetic or the visual representation of the movie itself. 4 questions about that. And 3 questions about how the movie views the world or its perspective on the things. So make sure that when you're watching it, you're taking notes and you are familiar with these questions in advance so that you know what you're looking for. Now, this is where it gets a little different than our previous media analysis in that there are some lists of movies here that you can watch. These are generally free, available on YouTube, but of course that changes from time to time on YouTube. So therefore, instead, I'm giving you some options of things that are available on Netflix. And lastly, and this is sort of the most important thing to this, you are welcome to choose your own movie, but just simply email me in advance and say, you know, I'm having trouble finding some of these movies, or I have a favorite movie of mine that I really want to analyze. Would you mind if I do this movie instead? And I have no problem with that. You just need to alert me in advance, okay? So if you're going off of these lists, just let me know. Shoot me an email and say, yeah, I'd like to analyze this movie instead. And that's perfectly fine, okay? Okay, so with that in mind, let's hop on over and take a look at color as an imperfect tool. And we'll look at some color models, some history of color models, and whatnot. All right, here we go into color. Now, color models, if you remember from our earlier discussion, were simply scientific and artistic attempts over time to try to understand and enumerate how humans see color. And it's documented as far back as the 15th century. So in the 1400s, people like Leon Battista Alberti and Leonardo da Vinci were writing about color theory in their notebooks. But it really took until the 18th century, quite a bit later, before the first working color model, the red, yellow, blue model, came into use and was documented. Now, this, of course, is not to say that other color models didn't predate this. It's just that this is the one we have the earliest documentation of. And you can see up here in the upper right corner, this is the red, yellow, blue system. Now, these, of course, were not light-based systems because at the time they did not really understand how the human eye worked and how light played a role in our view of color. So they were thinking of it more in terms of paint or other types of actual materials that you could put together. And so therefore this is a subtractive system where when you overlap the red, the blue, and the yellow in equal amounts, you get something close to black, as you can see here in the model. And of course red and blue makes purple, yellow and when red makes orange and yellow and blue makes green. Now, of course, you're probably familiar with this simple color model because it's the one that's used in like kindergarten when they're first teaching you about basic color theory and color mixing. Then about 100 years later, these two color models came into being, and you can read through these more on your own. I just want to do a quick overview. The red, green, blue system, which is an additive color model. By now, they sort of understood that light played a big role in understanding color, and so additive color systems are light-based color systems. As you can see here in this photographic example, there's 3 flashlights, a blue flashlight, a green, and a red. When you overlap them, you get white in the middle. So these systems of color took until about the 18th century, the 19th century, till about the 1800s to really sort of understand. And so the first one that was documented is the RGB system, which you can see a representation of it over here, similar to those flashlights we just looked at. Meanwhile, around the same time, within that same 100-year span, the CMYK system replaced the RYB system as a painting or printable version of the subtractive color model. Now, CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. The reason why it's K and not B at the end is because it stands for key black. And this model was specifically designed for printing purposes. By the 19th century, early model printing presses were in use, and so they needed some kind of system for printing. Later on, about 100 years later, the Munsell color system came into being, which is this one over here. And the Munsell color system took into account things like light and shadow, as well as chroma, or sort of density of color, which are things we talked about in terms of if you have, if you're wearing a blue sweater and you're indoors and then you go outside into the sunlight and then you go into a room with fluorescent lighting, that blue sweater is going to look different in all of those areas. And so Professor Munsell, Albert Munsell specifically, understood that, and so he built that into his color model, which came out around the 20th century in the 1900s. And then also around the same time, a company up in Canada called Pantone tried to, and successfully, monetized a color system known as the Pantone matching system. And so that system, of course, became used for wide-scale printing for consistency purposes. Now, we talked about a bunch of this in class. It should be familiar to you. Certainly read through this handout. Now, you'll notice that, we're talking hundreds of years this has spanned, and to this day, the only one of these that has really been sort of abandoned is the RYB system. But to this day, we still use the RGB for web design or for anything that appears on a screen, whether it be a television screen or a computer or whatnot. The CMYK system is still used in printing, as is the Pantone system. The Munsell system is still used in color theory classes for mostly fine art. And so they're still in existence. Now, this isn't to say that they're the only color models that came around. As you can see here, also in the 20th century, these color models were developed mostly scientifically, but somewhat artistically. The lab system, HSV, which is hue, saturation, and value, HSL, and the NCS system. Now, these all have specific purposes. Some are used in photography, some are used for scientific purposes, but they're not as widely used as the ones above, but they are still in use. Now, of course, learning about color, like I said, there's a lot you can learn about color. There are color theory classes. There's over 1,000 books on Amazon just under the basic category of color theory. And I have 2 websites here at the bottom you can check out. This one here is a color theory overview. It's a really nice, easy overview of sort of understanding color basics, and it goes through a variety of categories using the table of contents over here. So certainly check that out. That's a great primer for color theory. And then if you're talking about the psychology of color, this website here called Color Explained is an interesting look at color theory from a psychological point of view. I'm not saying this person's take on it is 100% accurate, but it is an opinion. And unfortunately, color does come down to an opinion somewhat. Now, there's 2 problems, of course, with color being unreliable. We did talk about person perception as well as as of light, but there's other issues, including that the color models don't all work seamlessly together. And I showed you this example in class about this vector graphic of an apple that was designed using the CMYK color model and then was later converted to the RGB color model for, say, web consumption. So, let's say a client hired you to design this Apple graphic. I need this for a t-shirt or for some business cards or whatever. And so you design it in CMYK because it's getting printed, of course. And you send it off to the client, and then 6 months later they say, hey, we're going to build a website. Can you give us the same graphic but convert it over to the RGB color model so that it can be used for web consumption? We can put it on our website. Sure, no problem. Let me convert it over. And you find that the colors shift drastically from this version to this version. No changes were made other than to convert the color models. And the reason for that is that even though CMYK can mix about 16 million different colors, and RGB can mix about 16 million colors, there are a certain number of colors that they cannot replicate. So it's a slightly different set of 16 million colors. And so it just so happens that these two greens, these two reds, and these two sort of yellowy greens do not have counterparts in the RGB color model, and so therefore they have to shift to the closest option. Now, if you sent this to your client, they'd be pretty upset, right? This doesn't look like my graphic. What happened? And so there is definitely a little bit of inconsistency between the two major color models, RGB and CMYK. There's also inconsistency from the Pantone system, because if you read here about the history of the Pantone system, they were specifically designed so that they cannot be replicated by CMYK, that they were proprietary colors, and you therefore had to buy the inks or the dyes or the paints directly from Pantone because they were trying to make money off of it. And you can read more into the history of it, and we talked about it a little in class. Now, so those are the technical problems. Then, of course, we did mention the psychology of color, and this other handout that's in the Week 12 folder is part of an article about the psychology of color in marketing and branding. We went through this a little bit in class. You can read through it, but it does talk about a lot of the inconsistencies in terms of the way color is seen from a marketing point of view psychologically. So be sure to read through that. Okay, so that is it for our overview of color. Now that we are back here, remember, get your media analysis done this week. You have the entire week to work on it. It's due at the end of the week, end of the day, Friday. Again, you can work on it with a buddy or work on it individually. Just make sure that everybody is turning in their own analysis. Also, nothing else is due this week. You'll see that under due, there's nothing else other than media analysis. So you're going to continue to plug along with your title sequence project, which is step 2, okay? So don't forget to be working on that as well. If you have any questions, need any help, want any feedback, be sure to either email me or poke into my Monday or Friday office hours. I am always happy to see everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.